Thanks so much, David. I hope my appearance on stage is not a testimony to that things in Ukraine never happen according to the plan. And something that also is a tribute to maybe informal networks, because I'm really moved as the first director of Open Ukraine Foundation to see the forum going. And I remember the first edition in the Diplomatic Academy. Some of my previous colleagues here had a bit nostalgic moment of how we thought it was important for Ukraine to be discussed not just in Brussels and not just in Washington, but in Kyiv. So I'm really happy that this Kyiv Security Forum is going and its network is increasing. As David said this morning, we were discussing the paper that Chatham House has just released last week under the title, "Can Ukraine Achieve a Reform Breakthrough?" It's a brave question, I think, that obviously calls for an answer, and the two authors of the paper are present here in the room. Irina Solonenko and John Laff are here, and it's also available in the English and Ukrainian version. So I will, in my comments, refer a lot to this paper, and just briefly to say that we were trying to make a certain balance sheet about forces that are pressuring for reform and forces that are obstructing reform. And of course, at this point, the conclusion of the paper is rather hopeful. We are saying that the reformers are marginally outweighing those that are obstructing them. But this fight between the old Ukraine and new Ukraine is painful, it's slow, and we have not, as the country, passed a tipping point yet. There are lots of obstacles to reforms. There are vested interests, some call them oligarchs, some call them, the transformation of the business capital into a political capital. There's also a quite strong segment of paternalism in the society where people are expecting the state to deliver. And of course, in our session in the morning, we discussed the growing tide of self-fulfilled people implementing projects through civil society organizations. But there are some sociologists here. How many of these people are? Of course, we say between 4 to 5, 10%. Can they be a sustainable driver for change? It's important to make sure that they sustain pressure on the government to be accountable and transparent. But also in the paper, the authors are talking about incomplete reforms and the legacy of the post-totalitarian, post-Soviet state. It's not very applicable to use an experience perhaps of Poland that went through the post-communist transition rather fast. Ukraine, in a way, mutated over the time of 25 years of incomplete reforms, and the challenge that is now on the shoulders of the reformers is, in a way, much bigger than before. But of course, the Ukrainian system in itself, we believe, has quite a strong resilience, these drivers, and some would say, perhaps this is less reflected in the paper, but the fact that Ukraine has a deliberative democracy, has party pluralism, on one hand slows down the process because we do have a coalition government that is trying to come to an agreement on difficult reforms. But on the other hand, it's the best safeguard, I believe, that this country will be moving forward in a sustainable way. I also think that, in a way, Ukrainians' resilience and hope for future reform lies in a creative, entrepreneurial, self-made business class of small and medium enterprises. We shouldn't forget about them, that they are, in a way, working and changing Ukraine despite everything that the government is doing or not doing. And these people will be building the base for either a new political party or for a new civil society pressure that will demand equal playing field for, first of all, private sector. Now, again, the key question for us as we organize often meetings in Chatham House around reforms is, how can the West best help Ukraine? There's a lot of foreign assistance coming, there's quite good level of attention to Ukraine at this point. So, there are some very specific recommendations for the West, and I do encourage you to look at those in the paper. But one of them is clearly support the change makers and people that are driving reforms. They are not a critical mass yet. We haven't done the arithmetic on the new government. It's too early to make judgments. There are some good people. There are some people perhaps with dubious reputation. This is wait and see how they will actually act on the reform agenda. But it's very important for the West not to be discouraged and to understand that there are people in Ukraine that are driving change, not only in Kyiv, but to keep a wider view on what's happening in Odessa, what's happening in Uzhhorod, what's happening in Lviv, because these are real local laboratories of change. And actually one of the strongest points for me in the paper is that reforms in Ukraine have a regional implication. And I know that Kyiv Security Forum is positioning itself as a regional security forum from Baltic to Black Sea to this kind of Central and Eastern European space. And what Ukraine will achieve or will not achieve will have an implication on what will happen in Russia, what will happen in Belarus, what will happen in Moldova, and who knows, perhaps what will happen in Central Asia. So I think it's important to keep that in mind. In a way, what is the responsibility that we all share here in Ukraine and in the West for a success? And I would like to also finish on one recommendation that is very important. We discussed with the authors this morning, is that the credit of trust for Ukraine is running out. Let's face it, the attention span is short, the doubts are growing whether the new government, whether Ukraine can deliver, whether it's worth the investment, and we should be mindful of that. We cannot take it for granted. So everything should be done as much as possible to reassure that Ukraine is delivering, that Ukraine has an implementation capacity to make this dream of so many millions of Ukrainians who were on Euromaidan come true. So, you know, reforms, it's not an instant coffee, it will take time, but we are hopeful.